The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew. After he fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, as they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "O you of so little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. So who was up at 1:30 in the morning last night? A wild night, huh? Thunder, lightning, rain sideways. The windows on the second floor of the rectory never get wet when it rains. They were drenched. It was a wild storm. And early this morning it was beautiful. 10 o'clock, not so much. And then by 11 o'clock, the sun was back out, huh? Kind of the story of the summer, right? It's been very up and down, and when it has rained, it has rained. It was fierce. And why do I bring all that up? Because storms are in the readings today. It's what we hear about, all kinds of storms. We hear in the first reading, Elijah was, commanded by God to go and stand on the mountain and to wait for the Lord to pass by him. And what do we hear about? We hear about a strong wind. We hear about crushing rocks, an earthquake, and fire. Maybe a little worse than last night at 1:30. And then in the gospel, we hear about the apostles. They were sent by Jesus to precede him. They got in the boat, and of course, the storm came and the waves crashed. And when is it that Elijah, when is it that the apostles realized the presence of God, realized the presence of Jesus? Well, for Elijah in the first reading, we hear very clearly it wasn't in the storm. It wasn't in the wind, it wasn't in the earthquake, it wasn't in the fire, it was in the very quiet whisper. It was in the quiet whisper that they recognized the presence of God, Elijah. And in the gospel, we hear really the direct opposite. Here they're terrified, thinking it's a ghost in the midst of the storm, and Jesus there reveals himself. In the midst of the storm, in the midst of the terror, there is Jesus in their presence. So, how does God reveal himself to you? How does Jesus reveal himself to you? Is it in the whisper, the quiet, or is it in the midst of chaos, in the midst of the storms of life? When is it that God really reveals himself? When is it that Jesus makes himself really known to you? And the correct answer, I'll be nice, I won't ask you to vote. I think the correct answer is hopefully in both. Hopefully in both. I know in my life it's true. Just one story, like Elijah in the whisper. For a number of years when I was at Our Lady of Pompeii, I had the privilege to have Mass at the Erie County Home. I don't know if you were ever at the old Erie County Home on Walden Avenue. The place was a disaster. They built a new one, up by ECMC, and they needed to build a new one. And I loved going there because the people who I served there were the poorest of the poor among us. And let me tell you, we sang every song so off-key at Mass it wasn't even funny. But every single person belted it out. And it was one of the most amazing choirs, second to yours, Daniel. And to hear, And there was one woman there, her name Sophie, I'll never forget her because same name as my mom. She was in a wheelchair. She looked like she could have gone to school with Elijah. She was so old. And every Mass that I had, when it came time for the Eucharistic prayer, how she did this, I do not know. She got herself out of her wheelchair and knelt for the rest of Mass. And when I would come around to give communion to everyone, she, like Elijah, bowed her head down and just waved me to move on. And that quiet whisper of the profound reverence of that woman, Sophie, God always spoke to me in and through her. And very often, in the midst of crisis and burden and running and busyness, God can also speak. Just the other week we had the junior high young people for their religious ed program, the family faith formation. And this particular day when I was going through was one of the very busy days, and a few issues to deal with. Do you ever have issues to deal with where you work, or at home? It's one of those days we had some issues to deal with. And I stopped into one of the rooms, and one of the pre-teenagers raised his hand, and I called on him, and he stood up, and he said, "I just want to tell you that my whole family loves you." And I was like, I needed to hear that today. And it was all the more valuable that it came from somebody who was right on the cusp of becoming a teenager, huh? All the more valuable. Sometimes in the midst of the storm of a day, God speaks to us. How is it that God really speaks to you in the whisper, in the quiet, and in the busyness of your daily life? How is it that God speaks to you? And how is it that Elijah and how is it that Peter and the apostles responded to God? How did they respond to that encounter? It's very important. First reading, Elijah, how did he respond? Like good Sophie there at the Erie County Home, what did he do? He hid his head, and he went and he stood at the entrance of the cave. He was so moved in an action of humility generated out of reverence for God. And in the gospel, we see Peter, and Peter can never have a bright moment without having a moment of failure. Did you ever notice You know, that guy, the tide turns within a second or two for him all the time, you know. And today, true to form, he has this brilliant moment, you know. Lord, it's really you. I'll come and walk on the water. And Jesus says, walk on the water. And there's Peter walking on the water. And then he realizes what he's doing and the force of the storm, and he starts to sink, you know. For Elijah was great humility. For Peter responded first of all in faith, but that faith quickly was eclipsed by fear. And that fear eventually issued into doubt. And sometimes maybe those moments for us are the same way. We miss the moment because for some reason we have fear leading to doubt, and that totally takes away the glory of God in our very midst. So what is it that we ultimately learn from the readings today? Well, first of all, from Elijah, we need to be like Elijah, that we'll find God in the whisper. And maybe we need to pay attention to that from time to time. And in that whisper, we first of all need the gift of humility to recognize God speaking in the whisper. And similarly, when we have that experience, it's a call of greater humility, just like Elijah bowed and hid his head. So from Elijah, we find God in the whisper, that grace of humility. 2 lessons from Elijah. From Peter, well, we need to see God in the midst of the storm. And very often we have storms in our life where we're called to see in the midst of the storm, God is the one who gives us strength and sees us through. And we're not to rely on our own resources. Why did Peter falter? He went from faith to fear and started to think he was doing it on his own. And very often we falter when we give way to fear, thinking we're doing it on our own and not relying completely upon God. When Peter relied only on himself, he sunk. And that sinking became symbol of fear and doubt. So we need to learn from Peter to have that complete trust. And when we maybe see fear or doubt issuing in, to work all the harder to give ourselves completely over to the Lord. So this day, this evening, what is the weather like in your heart, in your mind, and in your soul? And how is it that you're responding to that weather forecast?